The heat was a physical thing, a solid weight that pressed down on Annelise Vogel's shoulders and settled in her lungs. It tasted of dust and despair. The town of Redemption's End was a scar on the face of the earth, a collection of sun-bleached clapboard buildings that leaned against each other for support, as if exhausted by the sheer effort of existing. From the narrow slat of shade offered by the land office overhang, she watched the street. It was less a street and more a river of fine, pale dust, stirred into choking clouds by the passage of a lone horseman or the hot breath of the wind. The sun seemed intent on scorching the very hope out of the air, leaving behind a shimmering, brittle emptiness. Her dress, a dark wool affair meant for the civilized humidity of Boston, was a cage of sweat and regret. It marked her as alien, a creature from a softer, greener world that had no place here. She had been waiting for 3 hours. The stage had deposited her and her single, heavy trunk on the warped boardwalk and rattled away into the shimmering haze, leaving her in a silence broken only by the tinny, joyless plinking of a piano from the saloon across the way. A thick stew of stale whiskey, sweat, and desperation drifted from its swinging doors, a scent that seemed to cling to the back of her throat. Men stared. Their eyes, narrowed against the glare, were hard and assessing. They looked at her the way a butcher might look at a side of beef, calculating weight and worth, their gazes lingering on the lines of her figure beneath the stifling wool. She clutched the handle of her reticule, the cool metal a small, insufficient anchor in a sea of simmering hostility. Inside, her fingers brushed against the cold, familiar steel of the little derringer her father had insisted she carry. It was a toy, he had said, but sometimes even toys could bite. The man she was meant to meet, a Mr. Abernathy, had been described in the letters as a decent man of God, a homesteader who had agreed to take her on as a governess for his children. The arrangement had been made through a third party, a brisk, impersonal agency that smelled of carbolic soap and false piety. It was a lie, of course. She knew it, and they must have known it. There were no children. Mr. Abernathy was a bachelor, and she was not a governess. She was a mail-order bride, a piece of human chattel purchased for the price of a train ticket and a vague promise of security. But the alternative, the cold, damp alleyways of Boston, and the men who still hunted for her there, men with ink-stained fingers and dead eyes, was a far greater terror than this sun-blasted purgatory. Here, at least, the danger was honest. The rattlesnake warned you before it struck. The sun crawled past its zenith, beginning its slow, grudging descent toward the jagged teeth of the western mountains. Mr. Abernathy was not coming. A new kind of fear, colder and sharper than the generalized dread she had been nursing, began to prickle at her skin. What did a woman alone do in a place like this? A woman with a trunk full of books and linen and a past that was snapping at her heels like a starving dog. She was a lamb in a wolf den, and the wolves were beginning to circle. A large man, his belly straining the buttons of a filthy waistcoat, had detached himself from the saloon's porch and was ambling toward her. He was smiling, a slow, greasy expression that did not reach his eyes. Just as he opened his mouth to speak, another figure eclipsed him. The newcomer moved with a quiet economy of motion that was at odds with the town's lazy, heat-drugged stupor. He was tall and lean, built of whipcord and leather. A flat-brimmed hat, stained dark with sweat and time, was pulled low, shadowing a face that looked as if it had been carved from the unforgiving landscape itself. A thick, dark mustache drooped over a mouth set in a permanent, unreadable line. His clothes were worn and functional, a faded chambray shirt, denim trousers tucked into scuffed boots, and a gun belt that rode low on his hips. The star pinned to his vest was dull, almost an afterthought. He stopped before her, his gaze sweeping over her once, quick and comprehensive, before settling on the man from the saloon. He did not speak. He simply stood there, a silent, unmovable object, and the greasy man's smile faltered, curdled, and died. With a muttered curse, the man turned and shambled back to the saloon. The sheriff, for that was what the star signified, turned his attention back to her. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, a pale, washed-out blue that held no warmth, only a profound weariness. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much and expected nothing good from what was left to see. "You're the woman for Abernathy," he said. It was not a question. His voice was a low rasp, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a dry creek bed. Annelise found her own voice, a thin, reedy thing. Yes, I was told he would meet the stage. Abernathy's dead, the sheriff stated, the words delivered with the flat finality of a nail being driven into a coffin lid. Fever took him 3 days ago, buried him yesterday. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The heat, the dust, the hostile stares, it all coalesced into a single, crushing weight of utter hopelessness. She was stranded, worse than stranded. She was an unclaimed parcel, a piece of misplaced freight, with nowhere to go. Her carefully constructed facade of composure, the iron shell she had built around her fear, began to crack. She felt a tremor start in her hands and fought to still it. She would not cry. She would not show weakness in this place. To do so would be to paint a target on her back. The sheriff watched her, his expression unchanging. He seemed to be waiting for the tears, the hysterics he must have expected. When they did not come, a flicker of something, not surprise, perhaps something closer to clinical interest, passed through his pale eyes. The letter he sent the agency, he continued, his voice still devoid of inflection. He sent a copy to me, asked me to look out for you if, well, he was a good man. Worried. This was the complication. Not just death, but a promise made, an obligation transferred to this silent, stone-faced man. It was a debt she had not incurred, being paid by a man who clearly did not want to pay it. What does that mean? She asked, her voice steadier now. It means you're my responsibility until we can sort it, he said, the word responsibility sounding like a curse. He gestured with his chin toward her trunk. That all you have? Yes. It'll have to stay. I only have the one horse. He looked from the trunk to her, and then to the unforgiving glare of the open street. It was a test. Another one. Her fine Eastern sensibilities against the harsh reality of his world. She could protest, could argue about her belongings, her propriety, and in doing so, brand herself as a useless burden. Or she could accept. She could adapt. Survival was a series of choices, and this was the first one that truly mattered. The trunk is not important, she said, meeting his gaze directly. Getting out of this town is. For the first time, the line of his mouth seemed to soften, if only by a fraction. It was not a smile, but the barest acknowledgement of her pragmatism, a flicker of reluctant respect. He gave a short, sharp nod. All right, then. The land office will hold it. My name is Thorne, Sheriff Elias Thorne. He turned without waiting for a reply and led the way toward his horse, a rangy roan that stood hip-shot and patient at the hitching post. The journey was beginning, not to the life she had been promised, but into an unknown far more terrifying, led by a man who was as much a part of this hostile wilderness as the rock and the sun. The departure from Redemption's End was as abrupt as her arrival. Sheriff Thorne spoke a few curt words to a balding man inside the land office, who nodded and dragged her trunk inside without a glance in her direction. Then, Thorne untied his horse, mounted in a single fluid motion, and extended a calloused hand down to her. There was no courtesy in the gesture, only function. She took it, his grip firm and impersonal, and allowed him to pull her up to sit behind him on the horse's broad back. Her hands, by necessity, rested on his hips. Through the worn fabric of his shirt, she could feel the hard muscle, the unyielding strength of him. The horse shifted, and she instinctively pressed closer. He went rigid for a moment, a statue of tense resistance, then seemed to accept the necessity of it. He nudged the roan forward, and the town fell away behind them. The jangling piano, the guttural laughter, the suffocating miasma of dust and humanity, it all dissolved into the vast humming silence of the open land. The world became the rhythmic plodding of the horse's hooves, the creak of saddle leather, and the immense indifferent sky arching overhead. The sun beat down relentlessly, and the landscape that unfolded before them was a masterpiece of desolation. It was a canvas painted in shades of ochre, rust, and bone white, dotted with the skeletal arms of saguaro cacti and the low, thorny scrub of mesquite. The mountains on the horizon were a bruised purple, their peaks seeming to tear at the pale fabric of the sky. The sheer scale of it was terrifying. It was a land that did not care for the small, scurrying lives of men. It swallowed sounds, flattened perspectives, and seemed to drain the very will from a person, leaving only a primal instinct for survival. They rode in silence for what felt like hours. The silence was a living thing between them, thick with unspoken questions and mutual assessment. Annalise watched the way he sat the horse, a natural extension of the animal, his body moving with its rhythm. His head was constantly scanning, his gaze sweeping the horizon, missing nothing. He was a man utterly at home in this brutal emptiness, a part of its harsh ecosystem. He was the predator, not the prey. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. A burden? A nuisance? A ghost of a promise made by a dead man? She focused on her posture, on enduring the jarring ride without complaint. She would not be the fragile eastern flower he likely presumed her to be. She had survived far more sophisticated predators than this land could offer. As the afternoon wore on, the heat intensified. Her throat was a raw, dry passage, and her head began to pound with a dull ache. Just as she felt her resolve beginning to fray, Thorn reined the horse to a halt in the meager shade of a rock outcropping. He swung down from the saddle, then turned to help her. His hands went to her waist, lifting her down with an easy strength that was startling. For a moment, she was suspended, her face level with his chest, breathing in the scent of sun-baked cotton, leather, and the faint, clean smell of gun oil. He set her on her feet as if she weighed nothing and stepped back immediately, reestablishing the distance between them. He unhooked a canteen from his saddle. He took a short pull, then wiped the mouth with the back of his hand before holding it out to her. "Drink," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. It was a small gesture, a simple act of provision, but in the context of their stark, silent journey, it felt monumental. It was the first crack in his armor of stoic duty, a hint of a man who understood basic human needs, a core of decency buried beneath the granite exterior. She took the canteen, her fingers brushing his. His hand was rough, calloused, the hand of a man who worked. "Thank you," she whispered, the words scraping her dry throat. She drank deeply, the tepid, metallic tasting water the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. When she handed it back, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. She saw nothing but that same weary watchfulness, but she sensed a subtle shift in the dynamic. She had passed another small, unspoken test she had endured. Twilight was bleeding purple and orange across the western sky when they finally arrived. The homestead was nestled in a shallow basin, sheltered by a low mesa that glowed a fiery red in the last light of the day. It was not a ranch, not even a farm. It was a fortress of solitude. A small, sturdy cabin built of dark, weathered logs stood at the center, smoke curling lazily from its stone chimney. A well-worn barn stood a short distance away, beside a tidy corral holding a pair of mules. The place was Spartan, functional, and utterly, profoundly isolated. A wave of despair washed over Annalise. This was not a sanctuary, it was a prison of emptiness. This was where the silent sheriff had walled himself off from the world. He dismounted and led the horse toward the barn, leaving her standing alone in the encroaching gloom. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of wood smoke and pine. After a few minutes, he emerged from the main cabin, a lantern in his hand. The yellow light threw his long shadow across the yard and carved deep lines into his face. He didn't walk toward the main cabin's door. Instead, he led her to a much smaller structure tucked away near the edge of the property, a tiny line cabin no bigger than a pantry back in Boston. He pushed the door open. Inside, a small fire was already crackling in a stone hearth, casting a warm, dancing light over a narrow cot, a small table, and a single chair. A bucket of fresh water sat by the door, and a plate of bread and jerky was on the table. He had prepared this for her. He stood in the doorway, a hulking silhouette against the deepening twilight. He held out a heavy, ornate iron key. "The lock is on the inside," he said, his voice low. "No one will bother you." Annalise stared at the key, then up at his shadowed face. This was the most significant gesture of all. He was not her captor. He was not Silas Blackwood or the men from the saloon. He was giving her security, autonomy, and a space that was solely her own. He was a man of honor. In this savage land, among men who saw her as little more than a commodity, this simple act of decency was a shield. He was demonstrating, in the only language he seemed to know, the language of action, that he was not a threat. He respected her. The relief was so profound, it almost buckled her knees. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she could not name. He simply nodded, placed the key on the table just inside the door, and pulled it shut, leaving her alone in the warm, flickering light. She heard his footsteps retreat across the hard-packed earth. She walked to the door and slid the heavy bolt home. The solid, definitive thunk of the lock was the first sound of safety she had heard in months. She was a castaway, washed up on the shore of a strange and desolate island, but its sole inhabitant, for all his harshness, had just offered her a kindness more profound than any she had ever known. The days that followed fell into a silent, predictable rhythm. Annelise soon learned that Sheriff Elias Thorne was a man governed by routine and relentless work. He rose before the sun, the sound of his axe splitting firewood a sharp, percussive announcement of the dawn. He would tend to his animals, his movements economical and sure, and then he would be gone for hours, either riding the long, dusty circuit of his jurisdiction or working on some unseen part of his property. He never intruded on her solitude. His provision was as silent and reliable as the sunrise. Each morning, she would open her door to find a pail of fresh milk from his single cow, a few eggs from his scrawny chickens, or a stack of freshly cut firewood. He provided for her needs without ever demanding her presence, a ghost of a caretaker who left sustenance in his wake. Her small cabin became her world. At first, the crushing isolation felt like a weight, but slowly, it transformed into a kind of freedom. There were no prying eyes here, no leering smiles, or whispered judgments. The silence was clean. She began to observe Elias from the safety of her window. She saw not just the stoic lawman, but the man underneath. She saw the surprising gentleness with which he treated his horse, murmuring to it in a low voice she could never quite make out. She saw the patience in his hands as he mended a piece of tack, his large fingers surprisingly nimble. And sometimes, in the quiet moments of dusk, she saw him standing by the main cabin's porch, staring out at the vast, empty landscape, his shoulders slumped with a weariness that seemed to go deeper than mere physical exhaustion. In those moments, he looked profoundly lonely, a man haunted by ghosts only he could see. Her fear of him had long since evaporated, replaced first by a cautious curiosity, and now by a slow dawning, reluctant understanding. He was a man in exile, same as her. To combat the idleness that threatened to unravel her mind, Annelise began to impose her own order on her small world. She scrubbed the cabin's floor until the wood gleamed. She meticulously organized the few supplies she had. She took to walking the perimeter of the homestead, learning the terrain, the feel of the dry wind, the scent of the sagebrush after a rare, brief shower. This act of reclaiming her own time, of having a purpose, however small, was a quiet act of rebellion against the helplessness of her situation. She was not merely a ward, she was a woman carving out a life from the sliver of existence she had been granted. Her trunk eventually arrived, brought by a traveling tinker Thorne had flagged down. Unpacking her books, her few remaining dresses, and the small hidden case at the bottom was like rediscovering parts of herself she thought she had lost. One afternoon, she found one of his shirts draped over the corral fence, forgotten. It was torn at the shoulder, a long, jagged rip. On impulse, she took it back to her cabin. With the small sewing kit from her trunk, she mended it. Her stitches were fine and even, a skill learned in a world of embroidery and afternoon tea, now repurposed for this rougher existence. The act felt intimate, transgressive. She was touching something of his, imposing her own small mark on his life. The next morning, she left the folded, mended shirt on the woodpile where he always left her firewood. She watched from her window as he discovered it. He picked it up, ran his thumb over the line of her stitches, and stood there for a long moment, looking not at the shirt, but toward her cabin. His expression was hidden by the shadow of his hat, but he did not discard the shirt. He took it with him into the main house. It was her first offering, a gesture meant to bridge the silent gap between them, a declaration that she was not just a mouth to feed, but a person with skills and a desire to contribute. She was paying her way in the only currency she had. A week later, the unspoken arrangement between them was finally given words. He appeared at her door in the late evening, a rare and startling occurrence. He did not knock, but simply stood a few feet away, waiting for her to notice him. When she opened the door, he held a piece of paper in his hand. It was the agency agreement, the document that effectively quantified her as property. This, he said, his voice rough from disuse, was Abernathy's business, not mine. He walked to the small fire pit she had built outside her cabin, knelt, and touched the corner of the paper to the embers. It curled, blackened, and flared into a brief, bright flame before collapsing into ash. He stood and looked at her, the firelight flickering in his tired eyes. You are not a prisoner here, Miss Vogel. You are free. You can leave whenever you wish. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the vast, dark expanse of the wilderness that surrounded them. But winter is coming. The mountains will be impassable. To leave now would be suicide. The choice is yours. He was giving her back her agency. By burning the paper, he was severing the last tie to the life she had been sold into. By stating the danger, he was not threatening her, but providing her with the information she needed to make a real choice. Her continued presence here was no longer a matter of his obligation or her helplessness. It was her decision. I will stay, she said, her voice clear and strong, for the winter. He gave a single curt nod, the closest he ever came to expressing agreement or relief, and then he turned and walked back to the solitude of his own cabin, leaving the scent of smoke and freedom hanging in the cool night air. The first snows dusted the peaks of the mountains, a stark white warning against the deep blue of the autumn sky. The fragile piece of their isolated existence was about to be shattered. The need for supplies before the heavy snows trapped them completely necessitated a trip into Redemption's End, a prospect that filled Annelise with a cold dread. Elias seemed to share her reluctance. Stay close, he'd ordered, his voice tighter than usual. Don't talk to anyone. The town was just as she remembered it, a festering sore of dust and vice. But this time, she was not alone. Walking beside Elias Thorne offered a strange, invisible shield. The leering glances were still there, but they were more furtive, cut short when they met the sheriff's flat, cold stare. They were in the mercantile, the air thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and dust when he appeared. Silas Blackwood. He was the man from the saloon on her first day, the one whose greasy smile had died under Elias's gaze. Annalise learned he owned half the town, including the saloon and the loyalty of the dregs who haunted it. He moved with the oily confidence of a man who believed his money made him a king. He blocked their path to the counter, his bulk filling the narrow aisle. His eyes, small and porcine, raked over Annalise, ignoring Elias completely. Well, well, Blackwood boomed, his voice oozing a false geniality. Look what the sheriff's been hiding out at his little fort. I heard Abernathy's mail order package had arrived. A shame about old Jedediah. But waste not, want not, I always say. He smiled directly at Annalise, a predator's grin. The saloon could use a pretty new face. A woman like you could make a fortune on her back. The air in the store went still and cold. The shopkeeper froze, his hands hovering over a sack of flour. Elias didn't move a muscle, yet the tension radiating from him was a palpable force, a drop in temperature that promised violence. Annalise felt a familiar surge of cold fury, the same rage that had allowed her to survive Boston. Her hand instinctively drifted toward her coat pocket, where the small derringer now resided. But before she could speak, before Blackwood could spew more of his filth, Elias acted. He didn't look at Blackwood, he looked at Annalise. His voice was dangerously quiet, a low command that cut through the silence. Sit down, ma'am. He gestured with his head toward a nearby crate of potatoes. It was not a dismissal. It was a promise. It was an order for her to remove herself from the line of fire, to take a position of safety, because he was about to handle the threat. It was the most protective thing anyone had ever said to her. In that moment, she was not an outcast, not a burden, not a mail order bride. She was a woman under his protection. She was someone in his corner. She obeyed without hesitation, her trust in him absolute. She sat on the crate, her back straight, her eyes locked on him. Only then did Elias turn his head slowly, fixing his winter sky gaze on Silas Blackwood. Blackwood, he said, his voice a blade of ice. She is under my protection. You will not speak to her again. You will not look at her again. Are we clear? Blackwood's face purpled with rage. His arrogance warred with the primal fear that Elias's quiet lethality inspired. Protection? He sneered, trying to regain his footing. You got no claim, Thorne. She's unclaimed goods. She is not goods, Elias stated, his hand hovering loosely over the butt of his Colt, and my claim is the law. Now get out of my way. For a long, breathless moment, the two men stood locked in a battle of wills. Blackwood, for all his bulk and bluster, was a coward. He saw the promise of death in Elias's eyes and knew it was a promise that would be kept. With a snarl of frustration, he shoved past them, knocking a display of tinned peaches to the floor. This ain't over, Thorn. He spat over his shoulder before storming out of the store. Elias did not watch him go. He turned back to the counter as if nothing had happened and continued with his list. But Annelise saw the tight clench of his jaw, the white knuckles of the hand that was not near his gun. He was a man holding a storm in check. That night, back at the homestead, the silence was different. It was heavier, charged with the certainty that the confrontation in town was not an end, but a beginning. Blackwood was a man whose pride had been wounded, and a man like that was more dangerous than a starving wolf. The attack came 3 nights later, under the cold, indifferent light of a full moon. A blizzard had swept down from the mountains, a howling gale of wind and snow that entombed the homestead in a world of white. The storm provided perfect cover. It was a low, mournful howl from Elias's dog, chained near the barn, that gave the first warning, a sound cut short with a sickening yelp. Elias was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the rifle that always leaned against the wall by the hearth. "Get over here," he commanded Annelise, his voice a low, urgent growl. "Stay away from the window." The isolation that had been their sanctuary had now become their trap. They were cut off, alone, with no hope of aid. The first gunshot shattered the night, splintering the wood of the main cabin's doorframe. Annelise's heart hammered against her ribs, but her mind was icily clear. This was the crucible. This was the fight she had been running toward her whole life. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady. Elias peered through a crack in the shutters. 4, maybe 5. Blackwood's hired guns. He fired the rifle, the explosion deafening in the confines of the cabin. A scream from the darkness answered him. He worked the lever, ejecting the spent shell, his movements precise and calm. He was a machine built for this. "He wants you," Elias said, not looking at her. "He thinks he can just take you." "He is mistaken," Annelise said. She moved not to a corner to hide, but to the heavy trunk that now sat against the far wall. She threw back the lid, pushing aside books and clothes until her fingers found the false bottom. She pulled it free, revealing a long, felt-wrapped bundle. She unwrapped it with practiced hands, revealing the gleaming, oiled steel of a Winchester model 1873 rifle, identical to the one Elias now held. Beside it lay a box of cartridges and a Colt Peacemaker, a matched twin to the one on Elias's hip. Elias glanced over his shoulder as she expertly loaded the rifle, his eyes widening in disbelief. He saw the way she held the weapon, the easy familiarity, the focused calm in her eyes. She was not the fragile woman from Boston. She was something else entirely. "My father was a colonel," she explained simply, her voice low and tight as she chambered around. "He believed a woman's education was incomplete without a thorough knowledge of firearms. He called it the great equalizer." Another volley of shots peppered the cabin walls, chewing splinters from the logs. "Take the back window," Elias ordered, a new note in his voice. It was not the voice of a man protecting a ward, but of a commander addressing a soldier. He had seen her skill and accepted it without question, seamlessly integrating her into his defense. A silent, non-verbal communication passed between them, an understanding born of shared peril. They were no longer a man and a woman. They were a garrison of two. Annelise moved to the small window at the back of the cabin, which overlooked the barn. She knelt, resting the rifle on the sill, the cold wood a steadying presence. She breathed out, slowing her heart just as her father had taught her. The world narrowed to the snowy landscape seen through her sights. A shadow detached itself from the barn, a man trying to flank the cabin. She tracked his movement, led him by a foot, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a familiar comforting kick. The running shadow stumbled, fell, and lay still in the snow. For the next hour, they fought together in a deadly, synchronized ballet. They communicated in curt phrases, "Reloading," "Two," "By the woodpile," or with no words at all, each seeming to anticipate the other's needs, the other's field of fire. Elias was a force of controlled fury, his shots measured and devastating. Annelise was his equal, a ghost of vengeance at the rear window. Her marksmanship, cold and terrifyingly precise. The men Blackwood had hired were saloon brawlers and bullies, not soldiers. They had expected to overwhelm a lone man and terrify a helpless woman. They found instead a fortress defended by two expert killers. The assault faltered, then broke. The remaining attackers fled into the swirling snow, leaving their fallen comrades behind as grim monuments to their failure. Silence descended, thick and heavy, broken only by the mournful howl of the wind. The immediate danger was gone, but the cabin was filled with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder and the electric hum of adrenaline. The emotional wall between them, so carefully maintained for months, had been obliterated in the heat of the battle. Annelise felt a tremor begin in her hands, the delayed reaction of her body to the violence. She leaned her forehead against the cold log wall, the rifle still clutched in her hands. Elias moved to her side. He gently took the Winchester from her grasp and leaned it against the wall. Then his hand came to rest on her shoulder, a gesture of profound, unspoken comfort. His touch was warm and steady. "You all right?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. She nodded, unable to speak. He didn't move his hand. They stood there for a long time in the quiet, battle-scarred cabin, the blizzard raging outside. The shared violence had forged a new, unbreakable bond between them. In the quiet that followed, he finally spoke of the ghosts she had always sensed. "My wife, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with old pain, his gaze fixed on the empty rocking chair by the hearth. "And my daughter, Lily. Raiders came through 10 years ago. I was away, riding circuit." He didn't need to say more. The raw agony in those few words filled the space between them, a confession of a wound that had never healed. He was a man who had failed to protect his family, and he had spent a decade atoning for it in self-imposed exile. His fierce protection of her, she now understood, was not just about a promise to a dead man. It was his chance at redemption. She turned and looked up at him, seeing for the first time the deep well of sorrow in his eyes. She reached up and placed her hand over his on her shoulder. "You were not away tonight, Elias," she said softly. It was the first time she had used his given name. It felt right. In their shared crucible of fire and ice, they had found not just survival, but a fragile, hesitant connection, a mutual reliance that went far deeper than mere necessity. The world after the blizzard was hushed and clean, blanketed in a pristine layer of white that seemed to absorb all sound. The bodies of Blackwood's men were gone, buried under the deep drifts, their ill-fated assault erased by the storm. The immediate danger had passed, but the aftermath left their small world irrevocably changed. The flimsy wall of the separate cabin, the last physical symbol of their separation, had dissolved. Annelise did not return to it. She moved her trunk into the main house, setting it at the foot of the bed in the small loft, and it felt not like an intrusion, but like a homecoming. The rigid silence that had once defined their existence was replaced by a comfortable quiet. They moved around each other in the small space with an easy, practiced grace, their two separate lives merging into a single, shared household. A new language formed between them, one built not of words, but of shared tasks and small acts of care. He would rise early to clear a path to the barn, and she would have a pot of hot coffee waiting for him when he returned, his mustache dusted with snow. She took over the cooking, turning their Spartan supplies into savory stews that filled the cabin with warmth. He, in turn, began teaching her the skills of this land. He showed her how to read the tracks of animals in the snow, how to set a snare, how to tell by the feel of the air if more weather was coming. He was sharing his world with her, and she, with her quiet presence and the life she brought back into the dusty corners of his home, was healing it. She learned the stories behind the objects in his house. The small worn rocking chair by the fire had been his wife's. The faded pencil marks on a door frame, charting a child's growth, had been his daughter's. He never spoke of them directly again, but their presence was a soft, melancholic undercurrent to their new life. Annelise did not try to erase the ghosts. She simply made room for herself alongside them. She would sometimes find him looking at her as she sat in that rocking chair, mending a shirt under the lantern light, and the look in his eyes was no longer one of weary duty, but of a quiet, wondering tenderness. One evening, as a fresh snow began to fall outside, they sat by the fire. He was cleaning his rifle with meticulous care, the familiar scent of gun oil filling the air. Annelise was reading one of her books, the soft rustle of the turning pages a peaceful counterpoint to the crackling flames. The silence stretched, comfortable and deep. He finished his work, setting the rifle aside. He watched her for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. This house, he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to come from the very floorboards, was quiet for too long. It's better with you in it. It was not a declaration of love in the way the poet she read would have written it. There were no flowery words, no grand pronouncements. It was something far more real, more profound. It was a simple statement of fact from a man who only dealt in truths. It was an admission of need, an acknowledgement of her place, not just in his house, but in his life. It was his confession. Annalise looked up from her book, a slow smile touching her lips, for the first time since she had arrived in this harsh, unforgiving land. She met his gaze across the warm, flickering space between them. Yes, she agreed softly. It is. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the past and covering the wounded land in a blanket of white. But inside the small, sturdy cabin, two solitary souls, forged together in violence and bound by a quiet understanding, had finally found their sanctuary. They had found their home.